The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 12. The Intellectual. Chapter 7. Skin and Intestines. I am aware that the question of what is the suitable material for art, and then what art is, how constant its uses are, and so forth, would take us very far indeed, so far out of our way, in any case, that they cannot be followed here. What can be briefly said to some point is, the more art goes to science for its inspiration, the more of the inside of things, and the less of the outside of things, it will get into its shop. I have defined art as the science of the outside of things, and natural science as the science of the inside of things. Further, the more it buries itself in and burrows into the vitals of things, by surrendering itself to psychoanalytic suggestion, with all the paraphernalia of neuroses, to the testers' and anthropometrists' obsessions, the less superficial shape and contour it will have. Its objective qualities, in which it is supreme and which is its unchallenged province, will be surrendered for more mixed and obscure issues. Again, the biological sciences, which usually attract it most, eventually hand it over to the doctor, psychiatrist, etc. The doctor's clients are the sick and imperfect, and they become the artist's clients too. That is how it may get its present bias for disease. A preoccupation with the vitals of things is related to vitalist enthusiasms. Life, of the up life. Down art. Cry, means invariably the smoking hot inside of things, in contrast to the hard, cold, formal skull or carapace. The emotional of the Bergsonian dogma is the heat, moisture, shapelessness, and tremor of the vitals of life. The intellectual is the ectodermic case, the ideality of the animal machine with its skin on. Finally, the Bergsonian, Jameesesque, psychoanalytic, Wagnerian Venusberg, philosophy of the hot vitals of the bloodstream, of vast cosmic emotion, gush and flow is that of a blind organism. There are no eyes in that philosophy. It sees no more than the embryo, it is hardly yet male or female, it is sightless and neuter. It is the creed of a sightless, ganglionic mass, in short, and as such invites to that eternity of intoxication of the jibe of Plato. A person living at large, not constrained in any way except by the constraint of existence, which is very great, self-controlled, you would expect to be more deliberate than the average demented person would be. But it is the deliberation of Miss Stein, for instance, that is the difficulty. For pretending to be a lunatic is the same order of thing as affecting to be a child. Miss Stein is probably a clever, sober, intelligent woman, who has her head screwed on straight and has been a pupil of William James. She is amused by the stammering and fumbling of the poor lunatic, and, like an old child with a new toy, she imitates him. The comic juxtapositions and paradoxical features of the nonsense rhyme continue to amuse this intelligent, leisured student. So she goes on playing her game of witty nonsense. Such a lady is, of course, the perfect highbrow of the press myth. She is also closely related, through her whimsical vein, to the doctrinaire amateur of London art circles. Art, or rather tragic art and all religious or ritualistic art, has always threatened life or made the salutary pretense of doing so, that, as we started by saying, is its function. But it has not been its function formally to mollify and fuse the crust on which we live, that, by its very insistence on shape and measure, objectivity, and delight in the symbols of strength and animal health, it has tended to stiffen. The Egyptians, for instance, composed in their art the most enduring shell imaginable. They were the greatest enemies of death that have ever existed. We may come to be known as, above all, the friends of death. When we think we should be styled the friends of life par excellence, we may be its most notorious enemies. And in contemporary art, by way of the lunatic we are flying off the board towards extinction. By way of the child we are backing, or propelling ourselves backwards, into it. By way of the diseased and corrupt organism we are embracing it. By way of the strange dogma of the struggle for existence, for its own sake, we are glorifying it. Nietzsche was a death snob, as Whitman was a life snob, and he was also a madness snob. This is a very ancient form of snob, but formerly the madness snob never dreamt of going mad himself in his enthusiasm. Zarathustra, for all its splendid rhetoric, becomes ridiculous through the agency of this particular snobbery. Strindberg was a bad madness snob, cf. The Inferno, etc. The influence of these hysterical 19th century mystico-materialists is far from extinct. The plastic strength and composure that you get in a painting by Giotto, for what that is worth, could not be obtained from the most gifted lunatic. On the other hand, most lunatics can, and usually do, paint better pictures than you see in the salon or in the illustrated papers, just as most children excel their elders in visual sensitiveness, and for a limited period paint better pictures. Aesthetic expression, without being answerable to Tolstoy's simple peasant intelligence, has still somewhere some specimen person, normally functioning up to a point, not too constipated, myopic, or rheumatic, with a few teeth left, and just able to take care of himself without getting run over, or run in for indecent exposure, theft, or arbitrary behavior on a bus, lying in wait for it, and able to discredit it if it, in its turn, come to life, could do none of the things I have just enumerated. Wherever a work of art happens to be of such a character that you can bring it to life in fancy without trouble, it has to bear in mind this specimen person. The goitrous torpid and squinting husks provided by Matisse in his sculpture are worthless except as tactful decorations for a mental home. It is the intelligence and not the body in them that essentially has been smashed or spoiled. It is this that makes them more repulsive than a picture showing the disemboweling of a horse in the bullring, for instance, an execution, or a slaughter yard. The highly intellectual and methodic gibber of Miss Gertrude Stein is in the same situation. Even Dostoevsky as an epileptic fashion would be intolerable. He can only be born because he was the only epileptic of that time, so he owes a great deal to Tolstoy and his other contemporaries for being so quiet. Political revolution involves 1. Destruction, and 2. Reorganization. They are separate departments, but they necessarily work together, and sometimes get mixed up. Where they get thoroughly fused, as destruction is easier and more amusing than organization, it is that gets the ascendancy. But all art must be a political expression to some extent, and science exists owing to its usefulness. Politically it is extremely useful. And art today is more involved with science than at any former period. From this rapid capitulation of facts it must follow, if they are correct, that art is in the nature of things not much less political than science, and that destructive factors, as well as factors of organization, come into it. But in an intense revolutionary period it is inevitable, perhaps, that the destructive factors should predominate. As, however, revolution is certainly an impulse to new life, no matter into whose hands it falls, and as automatically new and organizable elements come into existence every year, present themselves for valuation, and invite to new combinations, much of a not purely destructive nature must also be there. Certain painting by Chirico or Picasso, for instance, music by Rimsky-Korsakov, mathematical theory of Einstein, contains a great vivifying force. What is destructive or, in the cases we have been considering, plainly idiotic or Moran-esque, is often absent from their work. It is to save the purest revolutionary matter from contamination with the impure over-political matter with which it is carried along, in the midst of which it has to live, that, once more, this analysis has been undertaken.